Chapter 1 Whispers of the Abandoned Village. The winding mountain road was nearly impassable, overgrown with wild vines and thick mist that clung to the trees like ghostly hands. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of rotting wood and decayed leaves. A group of 5 urban explorers, Leo, Mark, Evelyn, Hannah, and Jason, had spent weeks researching forgotten places across China. But none intrigued them more than Vanishing Village, a place wiped off maps decades ago. The village was said to have been prosperous in the Qing dynasty, but had mysteriously vanished from records after a series of unexplained deaths. According to local legends, the last inhabitants left in the dead of night, speaking only of the lanterns that should never be lit. Creepy as hell, Jason muttered as they reached the entrance, an ancient wooden archway covered in faded red paper charms. Most had been shredded by time, but one still fluttered weakly in the cold wind, its inked characters barely legible. Turn back before the lights awaken. Leo, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, scoffed. Superstitions. Let's check it out. As they stepped inside, an unnatural silence fell over them. No insects, no birds, just the soft crunch of their boots against dirt and the occasional whisper of wind through the hollow buildings. The houses stood eerily intact, wooden doors left ajar as if the occupants had fled mid-action. In the center of the village, an old well sat covered in moss, beside which stood dozens of red lanterns, some still hanging, others collapsed and forgotten. "Why are they all red?" Hannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In Chinese culture, red lanterns are used for celebrations," Evelyn explained, running a finger over the dust-covered wood of one. "But these feel wrong." Mark, the skeptic, laughed. Maybe they had a festival before leaving, or maybe ghosts threw a farewell party. His joke fell flat as a brittle, creaking voice interrupted them. One by one, the red lantern started to sway, though there was no breeze. And then, a single lantern flickered to life. A soft, ominous glow spilled from within. Something watched them from the darkness, and the whispers began. Chapter 2 The night the lanterns lit themselves. The sun had barely set, yet the sky above Vanishing Village was swallowed by an unnatural darkness, deeper than any night the group had ever seen. The mist that had lingered at the village's edge thickened, curling around the abandoned buildings like ghostly fingers. Leo, Mark, Evelyn, Hannah, and Jason had set up their tents in what seemed to be the village square, an open space near the ancient well, surrounded by empty houses and the eerie red lanterns. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with a silence that pressed against their ears. Then the first lantern flickered to life. Jason was the first to notice. "Guys, that thing just lit up by itself. All eyes turned toward the swaying red lantern hanging from a decayed wooden beam. There was no fire inside, yet it burned with a soft pulsing glow, like a dying ember. One by one, the other lanterns along the street began to shimmer, their crimson light casting distorted shadows against the walls. Evelyn shivered. "Did any of you light them?" "No," Hannah whispered. Mark scoffed. "It's probably some kind of weird gas reaction. Phosphorescence or something. Phosphorescence doesn't make lanterns flicker like real flames, Mark." Evelyn shot back, her voice shaking. Leo, trying to regain control, clapped his hands together. "Okay, let's stay calm. It's just lanterns. Maybe some hidden mechanism. A prank by another explorer." Then they heard it. A whisper. Soft, indistinct, like a breath against the nape of the neck. It didn't come from any of them. Jason spun around, flashlight sweeping across the empty street. The beam caught the warped wooden doors of the houses, the rotting banners fluttering slightly in the breeze, but no one was there. Another whisper. Closer this time. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath now visible in the cold. The wind picked up, but it didn't feel natural. It came in short bursts, as if something unseen was breathing in, then out. Then the whispers turned into words. "Why, you here?" A shadow darted between two buildings. Evelyn gasped, clutching Hannah's arm. "I saw something," she stammered. "Someone. No, something moved." Jason, ever the reckless one, grabbed his camera and bolted in the direction of the movement. "Screw this! If we're being pranked, I want to catch whoever's doing it." "Jason, don't," Hannah cried, but he was already gone. The remaining four hesitated, before reluctantly following. They weaved between the ruined homes, the red glow of the lanterns growing more intense, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. Then they heard Jason scream, a high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek that made their stomachs churn. They sprinted towards the sound, flashlight beams bouncing wildly against the cracked walls. They found him standing, no frozen, in the middle of a narrow alleyway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Jason!" Leo called. Jason didn't move. They didn't hesitate. The five of them sprinted back toward the center of the village, hearts pounding, lungs burning. The darkness behind them moved, as if the shadows themselves were reaching out. When they finally reached their tents, they collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The village was still. The lanterns remained dark. But something had changed. Jason, clutching his chest, let out a shaky breath. "She saw us." Evelyn's voice barely came out. Chapter 3. The Blood-Stained Legend. The village was dead silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but an oppressive, suffocating stillness that made the air feel too heavy to breathe. No wind, no rustling leaves. Even the ever-present hum of insects had ceased, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The five of them, Leo, Jason, Evelyn, Hannah, and Mark, huddled in their makeshift camp near the village square. The red lanterns, which had glowed ominously just moments ago, were now nothing but lifeless husks swaying in the unseen air. But that didn't mean they were alone. Jason's hands still trembled as he hugged his knees to his chest. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow. No one had spoken much since they saw her. The woman in the red bridal gown. The ghost whose eyes burned through the veil. Leo ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to maintain some sense of control. "We need to get out of here. First thing in the morning." Evelyn shook her head. "Didn't you hear what I said? I don't think we can leave." Leo scoffed. "That's just fear talking." "Fear?" she snapped. "Jason saw something. We all did. And now the village feels different." Jason flinched at the mention of his name but didn't look up. "Then we leave now," Mark suggested. "Screw waiting for sunrise. Let's just go." Leo nodded. "Fine. Grab your stuff. Will?" A loud metallic clang echoed through the night, cutting him off. It came from the well. They all turned, flashlights trembling in their hands. The well stood at the center of the square, its stone edges crumbling with age. A rusted bucket, which had been motionless all night, now swayed violently from the rope. The rope itself, it was moving, being pulled downward. Something inside the well was tugging at it. Hannah clutched Evelyn's arm. "Please tell me one of you tied it like that earlier." No one answered. The rope gave a sudden violent jerk. Then, a low, wet whisper rose from the well, slithering through the air like a breath against their ears. "Let me out." Jason bolted to his feet. "Screw this. We're leaving. Now." He grabbed his bag and ran toward the village entrance. The others didn't hesitate to follow. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally against the stone paths as they sprinted past the empty houses. The wooden archway marking the village's exit was in sight, but as they got closer, the path stretched. The village entrance, only a few meters away, suddenly seemed miles distant. No matter how fast they ran, they weren't getting any closer. No. Evelyn's voice cracked as she stopped, gasping. Leo turned back, his stomach sinking. Behind them, the village had changed. The buildings, once abandoned and broken, now looked lived in. Wooden doors no longer hung off their hinges. Red banners no longer looked tattered, but fresh. Smoke curled from chimneys. Lanterns glowed once more. And then, the voices started. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. From inside the houses, from the alleyways, from the rooftops. They whispered, they wept, they laughed. The village was alive. Jason stumbled back, horrified. What the hell is happening? Then the doors began to creak open. Footsteps. Shadowed figures stepped out of their homes. They wore old, tattered garments from the Qing dynasty, their faces eerily blank, their movements too smooth, too unnatural. But one figure stood apart, a woman in a red wedding dress, her face hidden beneath a blood-stained veil. She did not move, but they knew she was watching. Leo grabbed Evelyn's wrist and yanked her away. "The well! We need answers! Now!" They turned and sprinted back towards the square, the whispers rising into a deafening chorus. The figures did not chase them. They simply stood, heads slowly turning to watch. The well loomed ahead, its stone edges worn smooth by time. Leo didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rope and pulled, The bucket rose, heavy and dripping with something thick. Evelyn aimed her flashlight inside and screamed. Inside the bucket, floating in black water, was a severed head, a woman's face, her skin grey and bloated, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. But her eyes were open, and they moved. The corpse's lips twisted into an inhuman smile. Then, in a horrid, rasping voice, it spoke. "You should not have come." The sky cracked with a sound like splitting bone. And then, everything went black. Chapter 4. Marked for the Afterlife. A heavy silence pressed against Leo's ears as he woke. His body ached as if he had been thrown down a flight of stairs. The damp, rotting scent of the village filled his nostrils, making him gag. Then he remembered. The well, the head, the whispering corpse. Leo bolted upright, gasping. He wasn't alone. Evelyn, Jason, Hannah, and Mark lay sprawled on the cold, dirt-covered ground nearby, still unconscious. They were no longer near the well. They were inside one of the abandoned houses. The wooden walls were cracked but standing, the roof sagging under years of decay. The furniture was old, covered in thick layers of dust, but strangely untouched. Leo scrambled to his feet. "Guys, wake up!" Jason groaned, clutching his head. Evelyn coughed, rubbing her arms as if trying to shake off a deep chill. Hannah and Mark sat up slowly, their faces pale. "What the hell happened?" Mark muttered. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. "We blacked out." Jason ran a shaky hand down his face. "Where the hell are we?" Leo moved toward the doorway, gripping the frame for support. Outside, the village square stretched before him. The well was still there, silent, unmoving. The red lantern swayed in a wind that did not exist, but something was wrong. The air felt heavier. The village looked older, as if time had skipped backward. The sky, once an endless void of black, was now a deep crimson, like dried blood soaked into the heavens. But the worst part, the figures were still there, standing at a distance, watching, silent, motionless. Evelyn pulled herself to her feet, her breathing shallow. "We need to leave. Now." Jason hesitated, staring at the figures. "They're not moving. Don't wait for them to," Hannah snapped. Leo turned to Mark, who had been oddly quiet. His face was pale. Too pale. Mark swayed slightly, his breath shaky. "I don't feel right." Leo's stomach twisted. Mark's shirt was soaked in something dark. Blood. A deep gash ran across his back, just beneath his shoulder blades, as if something had clawed into him. Hannah clamped a hand over her mouth. "Oh my God!" Mark touched his back, pulling his fingers away. They came back red and glistening. Evelyn's voice trembled. "Mark, do you remember getting hurt?" Mark shook his head. "No, I don't feel any pain, but it's cold." Leo swallowed. Too much blood for him to not feel pain. Something wasn't right. "Turn around," Jason whispered. Mark hesitated, then slowly rotated to show his back. Evelyn sucked in a sharp breath. There was something carved into his skin. Chinese characters. Deep, jagged cuts, as though someone or something had etched them into his flesh while he slept. Leo stepped closer, his hands shaking as he read the bloody inscription aloud. "Bridegroom." The room fell deathly silent. Mark turned back, his face pale as a corpse. "What does it mean?" Evelyn exhaled shakily. "It means you've been chosen." A low humming chant suddenly filled the air. The group froze. It was coming from outside. Leo darted to the window, pushing aside the torn curtain. The figures had moved. They were closer, and now they weren't standing still. They were swaying. their mouths open, chanting in a language that made Leo's skin crawl. Then the bride appeared. She stood near the well, her blood-stained veil concealing her face, her crimson gown flowing like it was caught in an invisible current. But she wasn't alone. She was pointing at Mark. Then slowly she lifted her hands, and the lanterns above them burst into flame. Jason grabbed Mark's arm. "We're getting the hell out of here, now!" Leo pulled open the door and froze. The hallway was gone. Instead, an endless corridor of doors stretched before them, each identical, each slightly ajar. Jason cursed. "What the? This isn't how we came in." Evelyn stepped forward. "It's a trap. The village is trying to keep us here." Mark clutched his bleeding shoulder, his voice shaking. "I don't want to be the bridegroom." Hannah turned to him, her eyes wide with panic. "Then we have to stop the wedding." Leo clenched his fists. "Or we don't make it to morning." From outside, the chanting grew louder, and the doors began to creak open. Chapter 5: The Crimson Corridor. The doors creaked open one by one, revealing nothing but darkness beyond their frames. The air in the room turned frigid, and the once faint chanting outside grew into a deafening, suffocating hymn. It was as if the entire village had joined in, whispering, screaming, and crying in an unholy chorus. Mark clutched his wounded shoulder, his breath ragged. I don't want to die here." Leo took a step towards the corridor, clenching his fists. "We're not dying here." He turned to Evelyn. "Any idea which door to take?" Evelyn's eyes darted between the identical openings, her fingers trembling. "No, but we can't stay." Jason grabbed Mark's wrist. "Screw it, we pick one and go." Before anyone could respond, the lanterns inside the house flickered violently, then went out. Total darkness. Then, a single sickly red glow came from down the corridor. One of the doors further ahead was illuminated from within. A faint, rhythmic knocking came from behind it. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, methodical, patient. Hannah's voice quivered. "Someone's there." Leo swallowed, every instinct telling him that whoever was knocking wasn't human. Mark's breathing grew shallower, his body shaking. What if it's her? Jason's grip tightened on his wrist. "Then we don't answer." Leo turned to the others. "We move, quietly. We don't stop for anything." No one argued. They stepped into the corridor, the wooden floor groaning beneath them. The knocking continued. Knock, knock, knock. As they passed each door, the air around them thickened, making it harder to breathe. Their steps became sluggish, as if the corridor itself was pulling them down into its depths. Then, a hand shot out from one of the doors. Pale, bony, dead. It clawed at Jason's arm. Jason yelled and jerked away, stumbling into the others. The door the hand had emerged from suddenly burst open, revealing a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The figure's face was a blur of writhing, shifting flesh, as if a dozen faces were trying to merge into one. Its body was draped in funeral robes, its fingers impossibly long, ending in razor-sharp nails. The entity let out a gurgling, inhuman wail. Then it lunged. "Run!" Leo screamed. They bolted forward, shoving past the endless doors. The corridor seemed to stretch farther and farther, as if the village was toying with them. The creature's footsteps were impossibly fast, its elongated fingers scraping against the walls as it gave chase. Mark stumbled, nearly falling. The blood loss was slowing him down. Jason grabbed his arm, dragging him along. "Keep moving, damn it!" They sprinted past the glowing red door, But as they did, something whispered from within. "You cannot run from her." Evelyn's eyes flickered toward the door. Her instinct screamed not to look, but she did. For a fraction of a second she saw something staring back at her, a woman's rotting face, her lips stitched shut with black thread, her eyes hollow and bleeding, a red veil over her head, soaked in something too dark to be paint. Then the door slammed shut on its own. Evelyn barely had time to process the horror before Leo yanked her forward. "Move!" The corridor finally came to an abrupt end. A large, rotting door loomed before them, one that hadn't been there before. It was carved with symbols they didn't recognize, the wood stained with something dark. Jason shoved against it. "It's locked!" The creature's howl erupted from behind them. It was too close. Hannah turned to Mark. "The writing on your back. Maybe it's a key. Maybe..." Mark's head snapped up. His eyes widened in horrified realization. Then the symbols on the door started to glow. A deep blood-red light seeped from the carvings, and the door opened on its own. The group stumbled inside. The door slammed shut behind them. Silence. Only their ragged breathing filled the room. They had escaped the creature, but as they turned to take in their surroundings, cold terror flooded their veins. They weren't outside. They were in a wedding chamber. Red silk drapes covered the walls. Incense burned from small altars, filling the air with a sickly sweet scent. A large antique bed sat in the center, its sheets a deep shade of crimson. But what made their blood run cold was the table at the center of the room, a wedding feast, laid out as if waiting for them. 5 seats, one for each of them, and at the head of the table, a chair reserved for the bride. The air turned suffocating. Then, a chilling whisper filled the room. The ceremony must begin. Chapter 6. The Wedding Banquet. A suffocating silence filled the room. The scent of decayed incense and old blood clung to the air. The wedding chamber was eerily pristine compared to the rest of the decrepit village. Too clean, too prepared, too expectant. Mark's hands trembled as he stared at the feast before them. The 5 chairs around the ornate wooden table were carved with intricate patterns, dragons, phoenixes, and twisting vines. The chair at the head of the table, however, was different. It was taller, more elaborate, and draped with a blood-red veil. A chill crept down Leo's spine. "We're not sitting." Hannah swallowed hard. It's set for us." Jason took a cautious step forward, his breath shallow. The plates were already filled. But the food, it wasn't right. The steamed buns were too dark, their shapes misshapen as if made from something other than dough. The meat, glistening in rich, thick sauce, had a sickly, grayish tint. The soup smelled of herbs, but beneath it was the unmistakable stench of iron, blood. Evelyn's face paled. "This isn't food." Then, the chair at the head of the table creaked. The veil shifted, though no wind had touched it. Mark staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. The symbols carved into his back, the ones marking him as the bridegroom, began to burn. Mark clenched his jaw, his knees buckling. The wound split open again, fresh blood seeping through his shirt. Hannah rushed to him. "Mark, what's happening?" Leo turned to Evelyn, his voice sharp. "What the hell do we do?" Evelyn's hands were shaking. I don't know." Jason's voice was tight with fear. "We shouldn't have come here." Then, the room shifted. The walls trembled. The drapes fluttered as if caught in a phantom wind. The candles flickered, casting long, twisting shadows. And then, the bride appeared. The red veil lifted slightly, revealing a sliver of her face. It was rotten, pale flesh, stitched together with black thread, her lips sealed in a gruesome silent scream. Her eyes, hollow, dark, bleeding, locked onto Mark. A voice whispered from nowhere, "The bridegroom must eat." Mark let out a strangled gasp, clutching his chest. The food on the table began to rot. The steamed bun split open, revealing tiny wriggling fingers. The soup blackened, bubbles rising as something inside struggled to the surface. The meat twitched, as if it had never been cooked at all. Hannah recoiled in horror. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." Jason's face twisted in terror. "We need to get out of here, now." The bride moved. She glided toward Mark, her movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. Leo grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him away from the table. "Don't let her touch you!" But Mark's body was going limp, his breath coming in short gasps. His pupils were dilated, his skin growing pale and cold. Something was pulling him in. Evelyn's eyes darted around the room. "There's always a way out. There has to be." The walls shifted again, and a second door appeared behind the bride. A way out. Lyle's pulse pounded. "We go, now!" Jason threw his shoulder against the table, sending the rotting feast crashing to the ground. The moment the plates shattered, the bride let out a terrible, ear-splitting shriek. The candles exploded, plunging the room into darkness. A dozen hands shot out from the floor. Rotting skeletal hands. They clawed at their ankles, their wrists, dragging them down toward the splintering wooden floorboards. Leo kicked away the skeletal fingers gripping his leg, grabbing Mark under the arm. "Get to the door!" Jason and Hannah ripped free from the grasping hands, shoving Evelyn forward. The bride shrieked again. A gust of freezing wind blasted through the room, slamming the exit shut. Evelyn turned back, just in time to see Mark collapse. The burning symbols on his back began to spread, crawling across his skin like crimson vines. The whispering voice returned. "He belongs to her now." Mark's eyes rolled back. Then he stopped breathing. Chapter 7. The Bride's Embrace. Mark's body hit the ground with a sickening thud. His face was ashen, his chest eerily still. The symbols carved into his back pulse, glowing a deep blood-red hue for a moment. There was only silence. Then Hannah screamed. She dropped to her knees beside Mark, shaking him violently. No, Mark, wake up. Wake up." Her fingers gripped his shoulders, but his body was ice cold. Jason clenched his fists. He's not breathing. His voice cracked. "What the hell just happened?" Evelyn stumbled backward, eyes darting between Mark's still form and the veiled figure looming over them. The bride stood motionless, her head slightly tilted, watching. Then she moved, not walked, not stepped, glided. Her decayed wedding robes trailed behind her, soaked in something too dark to be crimson. Her hands, long bony fingers ending in blackened nails, reached toward Mark's lifeless body. A terrible whisper filled the air. "He is mine." The symbols on Mark's back began to spread across his arms, his chest, his throat, like veins bursting beneath his skin. His body twitched. Then, his lips parted, but the breath that escaped wasn't his own. It was a low, ragged gasp, a sound of something waking up inside him. Leo yanked Hannah back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "He's not dead. Move!" Jason grabbed Mark's arms, trying to pull him away, but something held him down, a force invisible but crushing. like 1,000 hands pinning him to the wooden floor. The bride knelt beside him, her movements slow, deliberate. Then, with inhuman gentleness, she reached for his face. Mark's eyes snapped open, but they weren't his. His irises had turned a deep, bottomless black, and when his lips moved, it was her voice that spoke. The wedding must be completed, Hannah screamed. The red veil began to unravel thread by thread, revealing more of the rotting stitched-together face beneath. One eye missing, the other staring, glassy, unblinking, filled with endless sorrow. Her lips, sewn shut with thick black thread, began to pull apart, the stitches breaking one by one with a wet, tearing sound. Leo lunged forward, grabbing the first thing he could, a candle holder still burning dimly, and swung it at the bride's face. The flames touched her veil, and the entire room exploded in screams. The walls warped and twisted, the drapes burst into flame, and the floor beneath them splintered apart. The entire chamber was collapsing. Jason and Evelyn hauled Mark away, the force holding him down finally breaking. As the bride let out a shriek of pure, ancient rage, the symbols on Mark's skin began to dim. His breath hitched, his lips trembled. Then, his voice, his real voice, broke through. Help me! Leo grabbed his arm. We're getting you out. Hannah choked back tears as Jason kicked open the burning door. Beyond it, a hallway that hadn't been there before. The village was changing again, shifting, twisting, trapping. They didn't have time to think. They ran. The endless hallway. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead of them, its wooden floors groaning under their frantic steps. The flickering red lanterns on the walls flickered violently, as if struggling to stay lit. Mark's breathing was uneven, his body trembling as he tried to keep up. The symbols on his skin still burned faintly, the remnants of the bride's mark refusing to fade. Evelyn glanced at him. Mark, are you? I don't know, he gasped, wiping sweat from his brow. It felt like I was drowning, like she was inside my head. His voice shook, the memory already carving itself into his mind like a nightmare he would never wake up from. She was trying to take you, Hannah whispered. She still is, Jason muttered. A deep, resonant thud echoed through the hallway. Then, a second thud. Something was following them. Leo's breath hitched. He didn't dare look back. Faster. They pushed forward, their steps growing desperate. The end of the hallway refused to appear. Instead, more doors began lining the walls. Hundreds, thousands, each carved with the same symbols that had been burned into Mark's back. A whisper slithered through the air. Choose wisely. Evelyn's head snapped toward the voice. Did you hear that? Nobody answered, because at that moment, every single door burst open. Hands, pale, decayed hands reached out from the darkness, clawing at them, trying to drag them in. Hannah shrieked, kicking away the grasping fingers. Jason barely dodged as a skeletal arm shot toward his throat. Leo grabbed Evelyn, yanking her away from the nearest door just before it could swallow her whole. Mark stumbled, his body weak. A pair of hands grabbed his ankle. No. They dragged him toward the gaping black doorway. Jason lunged, grabbing his arm. I've got you, Paul! Leo and Hannah grabbed hold, straining against the force trying to rip Mark away. The voice whispered again. Let him go! The bride's face appeared within the darkness of the doorway. Her blackened lips curled into a smile. Then, she lunged at them. Leo made a split-second decision. He grabbed one of the red lanterns from the wall and smashed it to the floor. The flames erupted, The fire raced across the wooden floorboards, devouring the corridor like a living thing. The hands recoiled. The bride let out an inhuman shriek. The moment her presence weakened, they yanked Mark free and bolted down the hall. Ahead of them, a single red door stood at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, this one was unlocked. Jason didn't hesitate. He slammed it open, and the group stumbled inside. Just as the entire corridor behind them collapsed, the door slammed shut. Silence. The only sound was their ragged breathing. Then they looked up and realized where they were. A temple, a place of worship. But the statues were wrong. Every stone figure bore the face of the bride, watching them, waiting. Chapter 8. The Cursed Temple. The silence inside the temple was suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of burnt incense, but beneath it lurked something rotten, something ancient. The flickering candlelight cast twisting shadows across the stone walls, where hundreds of statues lined the chamber. Each idol had the bride's face, her hollow eyes, her stitched lips. They watched from every corner, frozen in expressions of grief, pain, and rage. Mark leaned against the cold wall, his body trembling. His skin still burned with the remnants of the bride's mark. He tried to catch his breath, but something about this place drained the air from his lungs. Hannah reached for him. "Are you okay?" He gave a weak nod, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. I don't know." Jason turned toward the towering statues. His jaw clenched. "What the hell is this place?" Evelyn took a cautious step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "A temple, but not for worship. It feels more like..." She hesitated. "A prison," Leo finished. A sudden wind rushed through the chamber, though there were no windows, no doors open to the outside. The candles flickered wildly, and for a brief second, the shadows of the statues shifted. Then, a voice, a whisper slithering through the air like a breath against the back of their necks. "Why have you come?" Hannah's blood turned to ice. Jason turned sharply. "Who said that?" Silence. Leo took an uneasy step forward, his eyes scanning the statues. Then, one of them moved. It wasn't a trick of the light. One of the stone figures turned its head, just slightly, but enough for the faint crack of grinding stone to echo through the room. Then another, and another. One by one, the statues shifted toward them, their hollow eye sockets locking onto the group. The candles flared, casting twisting, monstrous shadows onto the walls. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. "We need to get out of here, now!" Evelyn scanned the chamber desperately. "There has to be another exit. This place is too big to be a dead end." Hannah's hands trembled as she pointed toward the altar at the far end of the room. Look. A massive stone door stood behind the altar, its surface covered in intricate carvings. The same symbols burned into Mark's skin. Leo moved toward it. "It must lead somewhere. You do not belong here." The voice shifted. It wasn't coming from one place. It was coming from everywhere. From the statues, from the walls, from the shadows. Then, a sharp, piercing wail erupted through the temple. The statues lurched forward. They moved. Their stone hands cracked open, revealing flesh and bone beneath the rock. The temple was alive. Jason grabbed Mark. "Run!" They sprinted toward the altar, the statues jerking into motion. their twisted faces frozen in expressions of agony as they reached for the intruders. Hannah tripped on her steps, her scream catching in her throat as a stone hand clamped around her ankle. She kicked wildly, panic surging through her veins. "Let go! Let go!" Leo turned, smashing a broken candle stand against the statue's arm. It shattered, revealing decayed sinewy flesh beneath the stone. The thing shrieked. Hannah scrambled to her feet, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "What the hell are they?" Evelyn's voice trembled. "They were never statues." Jason reached the altar first, slamming his hands against the massive stone door. "It's locked." Mark, barely able to stand, forced himself forward, his back burning. The symbols on his skin were glowing, reacting to the carvings on the door. And then, the temple shook. A deep rumbling sound filled the air as the carvings began to move, shifting and rearranging. The stone door groaned and slowly, agonizingly, began to open. But behind them, the statues were getting faster. What had once been stiff, broken movements were now smooth, fluid motions, their cracked bodies shedding the stone like dead skin. And in the center of the temple, a new figure began to rise, a figure in tattered, blood-stained wedding robes. The bride, her head tilted unnaturally, her mouth slowly stretching into a grotesque, silent scream, her arms extended outward, her fingers elongating, clawing through the air, and she stepped forward. Mark felt it instantly. A pull, a force inside him, dragging him toward her. His vision blurred, his knees buckled. She was calling him. Hannah grabbed his arm. "Mark, don't!" His body jerked violently. The symbols on his skin ignited, burning hot, like they were trying to rip him apart from the inside. His feet slid across the stone floor as if an invisible force was dragging him toward her open arms. Leo grabbed his other arm, straining against the pull. "Fight it, Mark! Fight it!" Jason roared as he forced the stone door open just enough for them to squeeze through. "Go! Now!" Evelyn pushed through first, followed by Hannah. Leo yanked Mark through the gap, Jason diving in right behind them. And then, the stone door slammed shut. The last thing they saw was the bride's hand, reaching through the gap, her nails inches from Mark's throat. Before the door sealed itself shut, the other side. They collapsed onto the ground, their bodies trembling, lungs burning for air. The chamber was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the carvings still embedded in the stone walls. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, a low, hollow breath filled the air. A new whisper slithered through the darkness. "You cannot escape the wedding." Mark clenched his fists, because he knew now. This wasn't over. Chapter 9. The Veil Between Worlds. The air in the chamber was thick and suffocating. The only source of light came from the faintly glowing carvings on the stone walls, casting long, shifting shadows that danced like restless spirits. Hannah pressed her back against the cold surface, struggling to steady her breath. What the hell was that? Leo ran a hand through his damp hair, his face pale. I don't know, but I think we just sealed ourselves in. Jason moved to the sealed stone door, pressing his hands against the surface. It was cold and unmoving, the carvings now dormant. "There's no way back," he muttered. "We're trapped." Mark sat slumped against the wall, his body trembling. The symbols on his skin had dimmed, but he could still feel them burning inside him, like a presence lurking just beneath his flesh. "She's not gone," he whispered, voice hoarse. The group turned toward him. Mark swallowed hard. "I can still hear her." Evelyn's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated. He didn't know how to explain it, but it was like a thread, a tether deep inside him, pulling him back towards the bride's grasp. Even though the stone door had sealed her away, she was still inside his mind. "You belong to me," the whisper echoed through his skull, and he clamped his hands over his ears, gritting his teeth against the searing pain. Jason crouched beside him. "Mark, focus. Where are we? Do you feel anything different?" Mark forced himself to breathe through the agony, eyes flickering to the walls. The carvings weren't just random symbols. They were a story. Shaking, he traced his fingers over the stone. The images depicted a woman in a wedding dress, her face hidden behind a thick red veil. Dozens of hands reached for her, twisting her into something unnatural. And at the end of the mural, a gateway, a dark void with spirits spilling out of it. Evelyn exhaled sharply. "This isn't just a temple." Hannah looked at her confused. "Then what is it?" Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "A doorway." Silence fell over the group. Jason's fingers tightened into fists. "A doorway to what?" Evelyn swallowed. "To the other side, to wherever the bride came from." The words sent a cold shudder through them. Leo stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the final carving, the gateway. "If this is a doorway, then maybe we can find a way to close it." Jason frowned. "You mean seal her in for good?" Leo nodded. "If we can break the connection between this world and whatever hell she came from, maybe we can stop her." Evelyn touched the carving of the bride, her fingers brushing over the grooves of the stone. "There's something missing." Hannah tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Evelyn turned to Mark. "The ritual isn't complete." Mark stiffened. "The wedding?" Evelyn nodded grimly. "That's why she hasn't fully taken you yet. She's waiting for the final step." A deep chill ran through Mark's bones. "She wants me to say the vows." The moment the words left his lips, a loud crack split the air. The walls shuddered. The carvings began to glow again, brighter this time, and then the floor beneath them gave way. The descent. The group plunged into darkness. The sensation was not like falling, but sinking, like being pulled into deep water. The air grew heavier, colder, as shadows swirled around them. And then they hit the ground. The impact knocked the air from their lungs, and for a moment everything was silent. Then Hannah coughed, struggling to push herself up. What just happened? They were no longer in the stone chamber. They had fallen into another place entirely. A vast, endless corridor stretched before them, its walls lined with decayed wooden doors, each one carved with names in ancient script. A single red carpet ran down the length of the hallway, leading toward a massive set of double doors at the end. The doors were deep crimson, their surfaces etched with the same symbols on Mark's skin, and beyond them, a dim red glow pulsed, like the slow, steady beat of a heart. Jason exhaled sharply. "Where are we?" Evelyn's voice trembled. "The other side." The realization settled in their bones like ice. This wasn't just a temple anymore. They had crossed the veil. They were in her domain. The Hall of the Dead. Mark rose shakily to his feet, his heart pounding violently in his chest. He could feel the bride's presence all around them, like a breath against his skin. She was here, watching, waiting. Hannah grabbed his arm. "Mark, we need to go." Leo moved toward one of the wooden doors, hesitating before pressing his hand against it. The wood was ice cold, and as his fingers made contact, a whisper drifted through the air. "I was the first." Leo jerked back. "Did you hear that?" Jason nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did." Evelyn's eyes widened as she scanned the names on the doors. "These aren't just doors. They're graves." Hannah's stomach twisted. "What?" Evelyn pointed to the script on the doors. "They're names. Names of people who were married to the bride." The horror of it sank in instantly. Leo's voice was hoarse. "How many have there been?" Evelyn's expression darkened. "Too many." Mark clenched his fists. "I'm supposed to be next." Jason grabbed his shoulder. "No, we're stopping this." Mark turned toward the massive double doors at the end of the corridor. His chest tightened. "She's waiting for me in there." Leo exhaled sharply. "Then let's finish this." The group moved forward, their steps echoing through the endless hallway. The air grew colder with each step. The doors at the end seemed to pulse, like something on the other side was breathing. Mark reached out. His fingers brushed the surface of the doors, and they swung open. Beyond them, a vast blood-red wedding hall stretched before them. At the center stood a stone altar, and above it, the bride. Her veil billowed around her, her stitched lips slowly unraveling. Her voice slithered through the air. The wedding must be completed. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the final ritual began. Chapter 10. The Wedding Ritual. The doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening finality. Mark's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he took in the blood-red wedding hall stretching before them. Rows of faceless figures dressed in tattered ceremonial robes lined the pews, their heads bowed in eerie, lifeless stillness. Their presence made the air thick with decay, as if the room had been preserved for centuries, waiting for this moment. At the far end of the hall, beneath a massive black chandelier dripping with melted wax, stood the bride. Her red veil billowed as though caught in an invisible wind, though the air was stagnant and deathly still. Her stitched lips twitched, the threads slowly unraveling, revealing the rotting flesh beneath. She raised one hand, and the entire room groaned to life. The faceless guests began to shift, their heads slowly lifting, though there were no eyes, no mouths beneath their hoods, just smooth, pale flesh, like unfinished sculptures of forgotten souls. A hollow whisper rippled through the air. "The groom has arrived." Mark's body jerked forward. Something unseen was pulling him toward the altar. His feet dragged across the stone floor as if shackles had latched onto his soul, drawing him closer and closer to the waiting bride. "No!" Hannah grabbed his arm, trying to stop him, but an invisible force hurled her backward, slamming her against the pews. Jason and Leo lunged after him, but the faceless guests moved, blocking their way. Evelyn clutched her pendant, muttering frantic incantations, but the whispers of the dead guests drowned her out. Mark couldn't fight it. The force was too strong. With each step, the symbols burned into his skin flared brighter, pulsing like a second heartbeat. The bride's veil lifted slightly, revealing her skeletal face. The flesh rotted away to reveal jagged teeth beneath her unraveling lips. But her eyes, or what remained of them, were locked onto him. "Do you accept?" Her voice slithered into his mind, cold as the grave. Mark's head throbbed. His thoughts felt fractured, his body barely his own. Somewhere in the distance he could hear his friend screaming his name. He wanted to resist, but then a memory that was not his own crashed into his mind. A different groom, a different wedding. A man dressed in ceremonial robes, standing in the same spot where Mark now stood. His eyes were wide with terror, his lips quivering as he spoke. "I do." And then his body withered, his skin shrunk, his bones snapped, his soul devoured by the bride as she drank the last of his life away. Mark's vision blurred. His mouth opened against his will. A sudden sharp pain ripped through his chest. The force dragging him forward snapped. The air shattered like glass. And then Jason plunged a dagger into the ground, right between Mark and the bride. At the moment the blade touched the stone, a shockwave erupted from the point of impact, hurling everyone backward. The faceless guests let out silent screams as they were blasted into dust. The red glow in the hall flickered, the candles bursting into sparks. And for the first time, the bride staggered back. Mark collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Jason pulled him up. "Not today, you dead bitch!" The bride's veil snapped violently, the ends curling like the tongues of a dying fire. Her lips curled back into a snarl, the last of the stitches tearing away. Evelyn grabbed Mark's wrist, her eyes wide. "The symbols, they're breaking." Mark looked down. The glowing carvings etched into his skin were cracking, splitting apart as if the ritual had been disrupted. But it wasn't over yet. The bride screamed. The sound was not human. The hall began to collapse. The ceiling buckled, the pews splintered into dust, and the air itself trembled with rage. The red glow behind the bride expanded, revealing something far worse than darkness. A void, a swirling abyss of suffering souls, their wails intertwining, forming a single unrelenting chorus of agony. Evelyn's breath hitched. "The portal, it's opening." Hannah grabbed Mark's arm. "We have to go. Now!" The bride lunged forward. Leo tackled Mark out of the way, just as her clawed hand slashed through the air where he had been standing. Jason grabbed the dagger, its blade still pulsing with the energy that had disrupted the ritual. He looked at Evelyn. "How do we close it?" Evelyn scanned the shattered carvings on the walls. The ritual was meant to bind her, to keep her trapped in this world. But if we reverse it, Jason gritted his teeth, then we send her back. Hannah pulled Mark to his feet. "What do we do?" Evelyn's eyes locked onto the symbols on Mark's arm. "He has to reject the wedding." Mark's stomach tightened. "And if I don't?" Leo's voice was grim. "Then she keeps hunting you until you say yes." The bride lurched forward again, her veil unraveling completely, revealing a rotting face twisted in endless hunger. Mark's heartbeat pounded in his ears. This was it. This was his only chance. The red glow intensified, pulling at him, trying to force the words from his throat. "I do." It was there, at the tip of his tongue. But then, Mark forced the words back down, and instead he spat, "I refuse." The moment the words left his lips, the entire room convulsed. The portal behind the bride shrieked, its pull reversing, the abyss collapsing inward. The bride's form distorted, her body twisting, warping, her hands clawing desperately at the stone floor as the void dragged her in. Her scream pierced the air, but this time there was no escape. The last thing Mark saw was her rotting hand reaching for him, her clawed fingers inches away. And then she was gone. The void snapped shut. The hall crumbled into dust. And then there was only silence. Chapter 11. Echoes of the Dead. The silence was deafening. Mark lay on the cold, cracked floor, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. His entire body ached, but he was alive. The wedding hall was gone, reduced to nothing but an empty, crumbling ruin. The once glowing carvings on the walls had faded to dust, and the oppressive red glow had disappeared. For the first time since they arrived, the air felt normal. Jason groaned as he pushed himself up from the debris. "Tell me that actually worked." Hannah stumbled to her feet, helping Evelyn, whose hands were still trembling from the spell. Mark glanced at his arm. The symbols that had been carved into his flesh were gone. His skin was whole again. No markings, no unnatural heat. "It's over," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But then, a whisper slithered through the air. "Is it?" Mark froze. His eyes darted to his friends. They had heard it too. Leo was the first to react, grabbing the dagger and spinning toward the source of the sound. The ruins were empty. No faceless guests. No lingering spirits. Just the darkness of the abandoned temple. And yet, something felt wrong. Jason swallowed hard. "Tell me that was just the wind." No one answered. Hannah took a slow step forward. "We should go. Now." But as they turned toward the entrance, the temperature plummeted. Their breath fogged in the air. The shadows in the corners of the temple stirred, and then the door slammed shut. A wave of cold dread washed over them. Evelyn's hand clutched her pendant. "No, that's not possible." Mark turned back toward the altar, toward the spot where the bride had vanished. The void was gone. The ritual was broken. So why did it feel like something was still here? Then he saw it. A small movement in the corner of his vision. His breath hitched. At the far end of the temple, where the bride had stood, the shadows began to shift. Chapter 12. The Price of Escape. The thing in the darkness moved, not with the slow, deliberate grace of the bride, nor the eerie stillness of the faceless guests. It twitched. It jerked. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, each movement wrong, like a puppet with its strings tangled. Mark's stomach twisted. This wasn't the bride's spirit. This was something worse. Something that had been watching them from the beginning. And now, it wanted them. Evelyn was the first to react. She grabbed Mark's wrist, her voice was sharp. "We have to get out. Now!" But as they turned toward the doors, the shadows swelled, blocking their path. The temple was shifting. Walls that had been solid melted into voids. The broken stone floor bent beneath their feet, twisting into something alive. The candles that had long since died out flickered back to life, but their flames burned black. A whisper curled through the air. "You broke the bride's curse." The voice was not one. It was many, layered voices, overlapping, some screaming, some laughing, some pleading, all speaking from a mouth that did not exist. Leo gritted his teeth. "Oh, screw this!" He lunged forward, dagger in hand, but the thing moved faster. A shadowed limb lashed out, slamming into Leo's chest. He was thrown backward, crashing against the altar with a sickening crack. "Leo!" Hannah screamed, running to him. Jason pulled out the dagger again, stepping between them and the creature, but his hands were shaking. Evelyn's face had gone pale. "That's not just a spirit," she whispered. "It's..." The thing's mouth opened. It had no lips, just a jagged hole splitting its face in half, stretching wider, wider, until it was an endless black abyss. Mark could feel it, a pull, not just on his body, on his soul. It was devouring something invisible, something that shouldn't be touched. Jason gritted his teeth. "Evelyn, tell me you have a spell for this." Her hands were trembling as she flipped through the ruined pages of her book. I don't know if I can..." The thing twitched. Then it lunged. Mark barely had time to react. The darkness slammed into him, cold and suffocating, wrapping around his limbs, dragging him toward its mouth. His mind exploded with visions, dead faces, mouths screaming soundlessly. Endless emptiness. This thing, it wasn't a ghost. It was a hunger that had always been here, and now it had found him. No, Mark thrashed, but the shadows tightened, pulling him deeper. Then, a voice. Not the creatures, not his friends. A voice that should have been gone. "You are not mine to take." The shadows shuddered. For a split second, Mark could see her, the bride. Standing behind the creature, her tattered veil floating, her empty eyes locked onto it. The thing hesitated, and Mark felt the pull loosen. That was all he needed. With a final desperate scream, he ripped himself free, collapsing onto the ground. Evelyn's voice boomed through the temple. "Leave this place!" A shockwave erupted from her outstretched hands, white-hot energy crashing into the creature. The shadows screamed. The temple shook. The creature reeled back, its gaping mouth distorting in agony as the light seared through it. The walls crumbled. The void collapsed. And then, the thing was gone. The temple imploded. Mark felt hands grab him, pulling him forward. They were running. The last remnants of the cursed temple caved in behind them, consumed by darkness. And then, they were outside. The night air hit them like ice. For a long time, none of them spoke. They just breathed. Mark looked at his hands. They were his again. The symbols were gone. The pull of the curse had disappeared. It was over, or at least, that's what he wanted to believe. Because somewhere deep in the wind, he swore he could still hear a whisper. A faint, lingering voice. A warning. You were never meant to leave.